Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Silicon Dragon Global Show today. We have a great panel discussion lined up for you and a group of experts who are going to be talking about what's happening with US-China tech and venture and business innovation and asking whether there's a reset in sight. So we'll be hearing from them in a minute. Let me just give you a few introductory remarks about Silicon Dragon. If you don't know us, this is a little bit about us, and hopefully you'll tune into some of our activities. A couple of books that I've written, a new one coming up soon. And I also want to mention that a lot of people have joined the Silicon Dragon Circle, and I really appreciate that. And that allows us to do these kind of events, these high-level professional events. So today, as I said, we've got a great group lined up. Actually, some of them know one another pretty well, so that's nice too. So Gary Rochelle, he is the founding managing partner of Qiming Venture. I've known Gary since I think way back, Silicon Valley, then China, then now Seattle, and now Palo Alto, and around the world. And then next, Wei Jiang, founding partner of CatchLight Capital. I remember convening with Wei in the airport lounge over there for Cathay Pacific, or was it United? And since then, we've kind of shared one another's thoughts and shared what's going on in the business. So that's been good. And then we have Paul Triello, who's joining us as the technology lead and senior VP at Albright Stonebridge, which he just recently joined. So he's very fresh to talk about all the policy issues involved. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. And finally, we have Kerr Gibbs, who is a private equity investor, and he is the former AmCham Shanghai lead. So, okay, that's a little bit about what we're going to be doing. And for all the you attendees, you can put your questions into the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll get to those as we go along. And please make them good questions. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to stop share and then let Paul start. Each one of us is going to give a few minutes of discussion from our viewpoint, what we think are the compelling issues in US-China tech and their own perspective. So we're going to start with Paul from a policy perspective. And then we're going to get into tech and venture. So Paul, go ahead.
Looking forward to a great discussion. Yeah. And I'm actually on the West Coast in the Valley, Silicon Valley, discussing a lot of these issues with clients and industry. So yeah, I think a week ago, a little bit more than a week ago, I would have had a slightly different start to the discussion here. I think the events of the last week have thrown a fairly major new and complicated issue into the sort of U.S.-China relationship, and of course, I'm talking about the tragic events in Russia and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things we've been asked about by clients, and I'm actually writing a long memo on, is how there are two issues there. One is, how does China view this? Where does China come down on this eventually, and how does this impact U.S. views of China, right? Which were already fairly negative. And then the second one is Taiwan, right? The issue about this emboldened China for Taiwan. I think on the first one, the jury is still out in terms of how far the U.S. position will change on China, depending on how China responds to the events, and whether China is perceived as backing Russia and not being sufficiently supportive of Ukrainian sovereignty, for example. I'm very skeptical on the Taiwan issue, whether China is going to take this as an opportunity to do something on Taiwan. I mean, if anything, I think this shows the Chinese leadership is rational and sane compared to Russia. But the problem is, before these events, as a result of the 4 February joint strategic statement by Russia and China, the mood in Washington was very much, wow, I heard things like this is the last straw, right? If China throws its lot in with Russia, then those in the administration who are more open to a more moderate approach on China, for example, and trying to re-engage, would have a lot less support. And of course, here we are now in early March, and the situation is even more complex. So I think that the good news before this was that the U.S. policy on China was starting to take shape after a year. and a lot of different events going on in the relationship. But I think that that's something that we look at pretty closely. And of course, it's been characterized as competition, confrontation, and collaboration. And of course, the Chinese are at pains to try to focus on the collaboration part and are trying to get the administration to not make the relationship all about competition and confrontation. The other thing that the administration has articulated is, of course, these other initiatives which are different from the Trump era, such as bolstering U.S. Domestic semiconductor manufacturing, for example. And that's a big focus of the administration. And of course, that has a China element, but I would argue that that's still mostly long overdue attention to U.S. innovation capacity. And then the second one, of course, is reaching out to allies to sort of operate from a position of strength vis-a-vis China on a whole range of issues. And so, for example, in the last year, we've seen a lot of movement on the EU-US Trade and Technology Council and on the Quad in terms of coming up with coordinated export controls and investment reviews, for example, and things like coordinated industrial policy on semiconductors, all with sort of an eye to China, although not necessarily all anti-China, but certainly with a sort of China nexus there. So that the administration policy then is before the events of last week, I think was becoming much clearer. There was also a big sort of trade and commercial engagement piece with Asia that's been long in coming. A lot of businesses have been clamoring for some sort of a positive agenda, for example, in Asia, along with our Asian allies. And so the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, for example, which is sort of elements of which have been rolled out in various forms over the last month, show that the administration is at least trying to come up with a positive strategy in Asia. And also with, of course, an eye to China's efforts to join CPTPP and other trade agreements, digital trade agreements in the region. So that process was also sort of gaining some steam. And then at the same time, these other areas that were a big problem in the Trump era, around things like export controls and investment reviews and restrictions on U.S. companies or U.S. individuals being able to invest, for example, in Chinese companies associated with the Chinese military. Those have continued sort of to be implemented and sort of rolled out steadily since the beginning of the Biden administration. But I think that the challenge here is, as we look forward now, is to assess sort of where some of those initiatives go. So, for example, China now has seen how the U.S. can, through export controls and sanctions, essentially sever a country's economy from the global economy. Now, in the case of Russia, for example, we're way beyond export controls because companies are just choosing to stop doing business in Russia. And so, from a Chinese perspective, I think that's pretty worrying. And of course, China has a much bigger role and equities in a whole host of things: supply chains, advanced manufacturing, financial markets, et cetera. So, that's why the current situation is so tricky because again, if Beijing is seen to be sort of insufficiently supportive of the Western approach on this, then Chinese companies could come under risk. And already we're seeing that, of course, with the difficult decision they face as U.S. companies announce pulling back from Russia and closing sales offices. Do Chinese companies follow suit here? And I think that the Beijing is trying to straddle this very careful line here. And potentially trying to become a mediator in this very difficult conflict. But Chinese companies are very much in the middle of this already. And I think companies like SMIC, for example, which was put on the U.S. Commerce Entity List last year, but is still able to procure lots of U.S. tools. And U.S. companies, of course, supply a lot of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. And so I think China's going to be reluctant to have companies like that flout these export controls. And continue to supply, for example, Russian end users who are coming under a lot of pressure, obviously. So, we're sort of in a dicey moment, if you will, in the sense of how that relation with the U.S. and China goes vis-a-vis Russia, and the impact that will have on these broader issues that have been part of the relationship over the last year and going back all the way to the Trump administration. So happy to delve further into any of those, but let me stop there.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Kerr, from your perspective, you are just back into the Bay Area here from Shanghai, and I mean, how from your perspective of cross-border Shanghai, San Francisco, any thoughts on these?
Yeah,
big
Rebecca, you're right.
issues?
Yeah, I'm just back from China, and I'm feeling actually really disconnected. I mean, it's funny. I was over there for about 20 years in Shanghai, and just got back here in December. And it's just, things move so fast in China that I'm already feeling kind of a little bit disconnected. But I still connect with friends over there and whatnot. So I have some sense for what's going on. But first of all, thank you, Rebecca, for putting this together. It's good to see you and connect with you, and also putting together this terrific group. As you said, a lot of us know each other from other previous lives, and we've got all kinds of things we can argue about. So that'll be fun. I'll just make a couple of comments to add to what Paul said about sort of at a high level on U.S.-China relations and some of these things. Hey, Paul's right. I mean, this last week has changed everything. And you'll notice the state. I don't know how many people watched the State of the Union address last night, but you notice, that speech would have been largely about China, and there was literally one mention of the word China. It was just sort of a passing reference about China as a competitor, which could have been made at any time. So that was kind of interesting to see. So just kind of at a high level on. And also just to clarify my role, I actually haven't been a private equity investor for a little while. So I've done all kinds of different things. I started in Silicon Valley as a tech person, and then was doing a bunch of tech stuff in China, and then got into investment banking and did a bunch of investments. So I've done all of that stuff. But the last probably 5-6 years, I've been very much a policy person, running the American Chamber of Commerce, and part of that function is both as a spokesperson for the U.S. business community there in Shanghai, but also connecting with both governments. So having an active conversation with both the Chinese government and also the U.S. government, especially in Washington, D.C. And I did make my last trip to Washington, D.C. in December, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But just a couple of comments to get things started. I mean, U.S.-China relations, of course, have been in free fall for quite a while now. And then this last week, if you can believe, I think is going to accelerate the free fall, right, if you will. And it's really unfortunate because, again, this week we're in the 50th anniversary of the Shanghai Communique. And so it really is tragic to see this unfolding. So to make a couple of comments to back up to talk about where we are in the relationship, I think backing up to sort of the last major checkpoint in the relationship, in other words, the last Biden-Xi direct interaction, we go back to November 15th when we had the video call. And that call achieved two things, just kind of as a reminder to people who don't watch this thing every single day. It achieved two things, which are important in the context of what's going on this week. One is Biden was able to reassure President Xi that regime change is not the goal of U.S. foreign policy in China. That's number one. And number two, the fact that Taiwan policy has not changed. And that really helped to stabilize the situation, even though it didn't really improve it. But a lot of things have happened since then. Obviously, the Olympics and that in the Ukraine. But also now we've got Mike Pompeo's visit to Taiwan, and that's going to be happening here in the next 24 hours. And I think that it's important because that's actually Mike Pompeo is a large part of the reason why President Biden needed to remind President or clarify those two issues. And again, remember that in Beijing, I mean, they have a very, very long memory. And they understand the U.S. political system very well, and they know that 2024 is going to be a different game, and Mike Pompeo is going to be playing an important role. And they remember that it was Mike Pompeo and his boss that said, number one, that China is the biggest threat of the century, and number two, Mike Pompeo's speech at the Nixon Library came really within an inch of stating or confirming that regime change actually was the goal of the administration. And so China remembers those kinds of things. And so I think what we're going to see in the next 24 hours, he's going to give a speech, meaning Pompeo, and we'll see what comes out of that. But I think more importantly is in the run up to 2024 and how this affects everything. couple of things. Yeah, a lot has happened on the U.S. side that certainly have caused damage to the relationship. Olympics, as we talked about, and then the use of the word genocide. And again, I'm not putting any value judgments on those events per se, but it's just those things have really been problematic in the relationship. The good news is the other major. I don't know how. Well, it's major to me. I mean, the China initiative. And that, I think, has done a lot of damage to the relationship, but also to things as they progress here. The good news there is, in my conversations in Washington, D.C., I brought it up at almost every meeting, and there was broad consensus that it was not being handled right. It was being implemented in a very clumsy and damaging way, damaging to the U.S. and damaging to our scientific community, and also to the relationship. They care less about that, but it was a mistake. And so that has been curtailed. I'm not going to say it's been repealed, but it has been adjusted in a positive way. So I think that's a positive. And I'm really reaching here to pull as much positive as I possibly can, because it's what's going on these days is not good. On the China side, yeah, this Russia-Ukraine thing. And my views are divided. I hope to get into an active discussion about this. I mean, I guess my initial reaction is and maybe I'm too optimistic, that the China position is even though they've abstained on 2 votes in the UN, but my sense is that there's still it's not a fixed position yet. And the situation is continuing to evolve, and China is clearly in a very complicated position and sort of turning itself into a pretzel to try and show how their positions are consistent. In other words, they've consistently said, sovereignty and non-interference, and then here we are in this current situation. And remember that the PRC has recognized the sovereignty of the Ukraine for the last 30 years. They recognized Ukraine as an independent country in 1991. Mm-hmm. So, and here, let me pause for just a quick second and talk about, just to reset a little bit here, to use your word, Rebecca, yeah. And to be very clear about, because in these kinds of conversations, we tend to throw around words like Russia and China in a way, but in this conversation, we often need to be very specific about when we talk about China. Are we talking about the Chinese government, or China, or the CCP, or the Chinese people? Or are we talking about, the loudmouths and bullies on the Chinese internet? And those are often very different things. And so we want to be careful. And also, and talking about Russia, we also want to make a distinction between Russia and Putin. And because I hope I'm not alone here, but I'm just not convinced at all that the Russian people really support what's going on. So let's see, so just a couple of comments. I think, yeah, the China thing brings you to a question, to a conversation about SWIFT.
Yeah, and it's like going forward, because I've seen it didn't work that well in other situations.
Yeah, SWIFT, well, it remains to be seen. I mean, sanctions like this take a long time to really kick in, but no, this is serious. I think decoupling the Russian banks from SWIFT is significant. I think the question here is, what's China's response to it? There's been a lot of discussion about China's, well, a couple of things. Both Russia and China are unified on the idea that they hate the idea that the United States is able to do these kinds of things and frankly weaponize the global financial system and control it in this way. So they hate that, and that's one thing they agree on. I think. Just a quick aside, Russia and China agreeing to dislike the United States is not a real foundation for a relationship. So I think long-term, medium-term, maybe we have to kind of watch that. I mean, I know they had their little love fest there at the Olympics, and no limits. I'm hoping somebody on this call can help me understand what that even means. Because relationships between countries just don't work that way. And does it mean something other than getting a great price on oil and grain? Hard to say. but I think the SWIFT thing, as people, Russia and China will certainly cooperate to help reconnect, Russian transactions to the global financial system via those two systems, because Russia has their own version of SWIFT, but these things are not immediate. I mean, it's not just like switching from WhatsApp to WeChat. It's much more complicated than that. And it's again, the SWIFT system is just underlying infrastructure. You still need to have banks actually connect to it. Let's see, but that said, I mean, I think the long-term implication here is you're going to see much more activity and discussion around China's version of SWIFT, and also the central bank digital currency, the eRMB. A big question here that's been out there for a couple of years is what's China's enthusiasm to internationalize the eRMB. And those of us who've been watching China for a long time have sort of, we saw the fake left go right there on internationalizing the RMB. And so we're not going to be fooled quite so easily here, but that's an open question, I think, and as to what China is going to do with respect to internationalizing the eRMB. One other point, I think Paul kind of mentioned that, and he's the expert on the tech space when we talk about SMIC and Lenovo, and it'll be interesting to see. I mean, right now Russia actually gets a fair bit of their technology. Most of their semiconductor, probably 2/3 of their semiconductors come from China, and most of their electronics as well. So you're going to see that go from a very high percentage to 100%. So Russia is going to be 100% dependent on China for supply of their technology. And again, SMIC has been selling to Russia, even though they are saying, but remember, I mean, SMIC uses US suppliers for the equipment. And so I think China needs to be worried about secondary sanctions if the US starts seeing this as a long-term thing. I'm going to pause. Well, I'll just make two last. Yeah, go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah,
I was
so I was just thinking, that's a case where the decoupling is kind of backfired, right?
Decoupling, yeah, and I think just I think that was going to be my last point. I think the decoupling of the economies. Yeah. I think a lot of us who consider ourselves optimists have sort of been looking at the decoupling as a temporary thing that can be reversed, and the two governments will eventually figure this out, and we'll get back to something looking like normal. If this becomes a long, protracted thing, and if China really does join with Russia and they form this group, North Korea, China, Russia, and all the other pariah states, right. That's going to be a problem. That will lead to sort of codifying this decoupling, and that will be not a good thing. And then the last thing I'll say before hearing from Gary and Wei is same thing on the and this affects, I think, how our technology cooperation can take place or not take place, and that is sort of the foreigners leaving China. This is, it was something that was pre-COVID. It was already a trend that there's been a downward slide in the number of foreigners living in China, and all three of us actually, Gary, Wei, and myself, we used to hang out in China, in Shanghai all the time, and our community has been. It was declining already, and now it's really being decimated. I mean, figures are anywhere from down by 1/3 to 50%, and this is due to COVID. And it's due to COVID and the travel restrictions that are. And if that becomes sort of a long-term thing, then it becomes much more difficult for cooperation between Silicon Valley and China. So I'll pause there, Rebecca, and then looking forward to more discussion around all these points.
Okay, good. Lots of good points there. Wei, why don't you go next?
Great. So briefly, what we do really is highly related to the geopolitical situation. And so briefly, we help the affected parties to stabilize the situation, meaning that we're in a the venture business. And years ago, I was working for a top tier Chinese fund. And then since 2018, a new law was introduced, the CFIUS law. And then we heard US entrepreneurs came to us and say, look, we were honored to have your investment, but not anymore. It's more trouble. Then we hear complaints from our co-investors, US co-investors. So that's the genesis of our fund, right? We set up a fund and we raise money from the US investors. And then we buy out the US assets from the Chinese investors. So basically that's what we do. And then so everybody's happy. Hopefully we're friend to everybody, including the Chinese investors, right? We offer them an option to exit. So coming back to the topic of the day, we watch the geopolitical situations very closely. And then, these actually do have impact on our business, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes not so positive. We also invest in the Chinese Americans doing startups in here in the Valley. And since most of the Chinese VCs have gone from the US, and those new entrepreneurs would have a bigger trouble, more challenge to raise funds. So we step in and then help them. But my overall takeaway, maybe this is a bigger picture for me, is that over the last few decades, I experienced and firsthand, I also watched the situation between US and China, having lived in both places, is that number one, the US and China are so highly complementary, right? In so many ways, science, technology, culture, even for the people, right? I feel like they can really easily relate to each other. So the US will continue to lead in science and technology and many other things, while resolving some of the fundamental issues. On the Chinese side, I feel like the Chinese civilization has been long and resilient. It doesn't take much for it to flourish, right? So if I look at the history, it just, if you give them 60, 70 years of a window of peacetime, right? Their civilization bloom, so that's why you have unfortunately, there are only a handful of such windows, right? In the last 2,500 years. So therefore you have a handful of peaks, right? In the civilization. But what happened in the last 40 years, right, is not really a big surprise to me. All the country did, or the CCP did, is kind of unshackled a few things. So I'm pretty long-term, I'm pretty positive on the Chinese economy. But the question for us, maybe this generation is, how do we find a way to make sure that the two, great peoples that coexist and then, collaborate even, right? So if we have a solution for that, the world would be a better place. So I'll pause at this point.
Yeah.
Amen to that.
There is a lot of likeness, I think. And so Gary, why don't you wrap it up for us here?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made. I mean, I think what Wei said, I certainly agree on the long-term prospect for China. And in fact, I'll make a couple comments about the way the capital is flowing, which clearly indicate that the capital markets would generally agree with that. I'd also comment that Wang Yi, the foreign minister, has said that China and Russia are not allies. He very specifically called that out. And so I think that the idea that there's some great cabal of Russia, China, et cetera. Number one, Russia's economy is 1/10 the size of China. And you add in Belarus, you add in North Korea, so it doesn't matter. They're all, it's midges around it. There's one giant dog, there's a flea, and then there's a bunch of midges. It makes no difference. And so it's all about China in terms of the economic side of things. I would think that in terms of a reset, there is no reset. The relationship, there's no, and thank goodness, because I can't imagine what kind of button Hillary would hit if she had a Chinese reset button. I mean, she had enough trouble with the Russian reset button, but the Chinese reset button may be a real problem. But you kind of look at this and say, what's really changing? And capital flows are continue at record levels. Venture capital flows continue at record levels. Chinese firms are experimenting with listing overseas. You know, the Hong Kong market has its own problems, but much of that is self-inflicted wounds. The technology infrastructure in China, when you talk about entrepreneurs, our portfolio companies are certainly not suffering. What you're seeing is the decoupling that's occurring is the decoupling of the traditional Chinese industry from the new wave of Chinese industry, the technology-driven Chinese industries. And that new generation, just as happens in Silicon Valley, just as happens elsewhere in the world, that's where the growth goes. And historically, the last 25 years, most of the growth has already been in private companies. But a lot of that was not necessarily tech. Tech is taking on a larger piece of that. Perfect example is when you look at the enterprise software and the entire software infrastructure for what China, how China operates today, government, industry, et cetera, it needs a massive reset. That needs a massive rehosting, if you will, because productivity is a software problem, and they've had falling productivity in many of the service sectors for a long time. So that is about recreating an entire software infrastructure. So as an investment opportunity, that's phenomenal for firms that are doing business in China. They're restricting access to that to Chinese firms. They don't want to be dependent upon foreign software. That's not terribly surprising, and it's not that different than what a lot of other countries have done. So if you look at, is there a reset? No. Is there decoupling? No. Then you start to look at, well, where do you see this? You see this transition occurring from consumer-driven investing to enterprise and more core technology investing. That's been going on for a good 7 or 8 years. This is not a new phenomenon, but is now reaching a scale that's attracting more attention. And if you look at specific areas, you clearly have AI, you have advanced manufacturing, you have the entire enterprise software, as we talked about. Healthcare is absolutely exploding in terms of the amount of investment. Also an area that continues to have quite a bit of cross-border cooperation between different firms and cross-licensing agreements. And then you have semiconductors. Semiconductors might be the one that's most strategically fraught because of Taiwan.
Yeah.
But you've gone from having a couple dozen startups funded in 2007, 2008, 2009 to having several hundred started every year now. And the capital is on it's 50, 100 times the amount that it was at that period. So clearly that's an investable area. The thing that the Chinese government is figuring out, though, you look at how Tsinghua semiconductor blew up. It basically needed a bailout. And that was, Unigroup, that was their kind of, with SMIC and a couple others, that was their big strategic initiative. And it's been a train wreck because governments can't run companies.
Yeah.
The US, people have tried it. It doesn't work. And so it's something that they're going to have to get their head around, how they actually invest in sectors and technology and not try to pick winners. The more the government, anytime a Chinese government tries to pick a winner in a sector by picking a company, I never worry about that. It's more a question of how much money is going to go into particular sectors. Now, good example, now they have this program called the Little Giants, and they're going to pick 3,000 companies to become little giant companies. So you go and you talk to the entrepreneurs and you talk to the venture capitalists in China. How are they picking those companies? Well, they're not talking to us. They're not talking to Sequoia. They're not talking to Matrix. So they have a bunch of people, bureaucrats running around trying to identify what the next Alibaba is going to be. Good bloody luck. And so again, there's a lot of activity and there's a lot of noise, but I think the reality of much of that is extremely small in terms of the impact. And so what happens is venture capital is a long-term game. It's continuing. And I'll give one quick anecdote. So Qiming is in the middle of raising a very large fund. It'll be substantially larger than anything we've raised before. In the last 4 months, we've put together this pool of capital. No US investors pulled out, 0. No endowments, no foundations, no high net worth individuals, and there's a significant amount of new money that's come in. So if there was a reset, if there was a decoupling, you would think that large institutional capital that was long-term 10, 15, 20-year capital, you would think they'd be saying, okay, we can't trust investing in China. That has not been the case at all. So I'll stop there, but
that's really interesting.
Yeah, when you just look at the facts, The problem is the government people think that they know more than the private sector. And this is a continuing problem for the US. And it's now, I mean, it's a continuing problem. It's going to become more of a problem for China. There are hundreds of interactions between government officials in the US and China every day. There are thousands of interactions in the business community. And it is amazingly how brain dead the US government has been about tapping into that information flow to try to better inform their own positions. I'm extremely frustrated. I've been spending a lot of time on this, and it's extremely frustrating to watch how poorly the information actually flows when all they have to do is ask. But for some reason, you get a government title and you suddenly assume, well, you know more. So that history is not bearing that out. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay, very good. You know, I put together a few little slides to kind of also set the stage a little bit here. So let me just pull those up. Because you talked about, you already talked about the venture capital explosion. And well, here's just some of the points that I thought we could dive into, which we're already deep into. But anyhow, on the China side, you know, record year, China VC record year, US VC record year.
Okay, Rebecca,
Yes.
we should be a little careful. So when you look at those numbers, that 460 billion of venture capital,
Yeah.
to me, 25-30% is really venture capital.
Okay.
You know, I don't think putting $150 million at 30 billion in a pre-IPO deal or some of these, that's not venture capital. So, but even if you strip all that away, it's still at record, historically record levels.
Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. A good point. And then, you know, I think if you look at the US share of global VC spending, it's also been quite a change. And I think this is largely because of China's rise in this field. But 50% of spending today is from the US, and it was 84% not that long ago. Same thing on the R&D side. These are figures from the US. China's gained up to 23% of spending globally, and the US is 25%, so China catching up. And then if you look at the venture flows, the cross-border VC flows, you could see that, you know, it was very active, particularly 2017, 2018, US VC to China, and then dramatically dropped in 2020. So okay. I haven't seen the numbers for 2021, but I presume it's still the same.
Can I say one thing though? This is very misleading, because to me, this is US-based funds investing in China. And what's happened is virtually every US-based fund that wound up wanting to invest in China set up their own operation in China.
That's true.
And so whether it's Sequoia, whether it's Matrix, whether it's Greylock, and you go down the list. So there's not a lot of large institutional investors in tech based in the US trying to do deals in China. And the same thing, the China side to the US, that's largely geopolitical. And that's CFIUS, and that's part of the reason Wei Jiang has a great business with CatchLight, is that it's just become much more restrictive. But I think this is a little tricky to really cover.
It is, and you know, you have to go with you know, Rhodium Group is a very respected group, and so I know I get what you're saying. And one more thing, China's R&D push, we talked about that already. And looking at the numbers from SaaS, robotics, semiconductor, and biotech, and what it was in 2016 versus what it was in 2020. So as you can see, it's an upward curve, a major upward curve, particularly in semiconductors and biotech, which I know biotech's one of the most active sectors. So a real switch on China's part in spending in those areas. Widening gap in the chip investment between China and the US. Well, you see the numbers there, where it was fairly similar in 2019, according to Preqin. Now there's a big split. So as we talked about, there's a major investment going into China semiconductors. So I'm going to stop there so we can have a little bit more discussion on that. And thank you, Gary, for keeping it lively. And anyone else would like to comment on those kind of trends and and this these points that we have here as well.
I would just take a little issue with the U.S. investment on the semiconductor space. I mean, I think we have something like 98 billion committed, you know, in the U.S. to investment between Intel and TSMC and Samsung for onshoring advanced manufacturing. So, you know, those are huge numbers. And then, of course, you have the U.S. CHIPS Act, which is going to include, whenever it gets passed, 52 billion in incentives, and then there's a whole separate tax incentive bill too. So those numbers are likely to, in the U.S., are likely to go way up. You know, and so when you look at the numbers for China, they're still pretty small, and particularly if you look at Taiwan and TSMC's capex for the next couple of years, and Samsung in Korea, and in Japan, where the numbers are really starting to go big time. So it depends on, you know, what you're talking about there. If it's like building fabs, high-end fabs. I mean, China, you know, SMIC is not building new high-end fabs in part because of U.S. export controls, and because they can't get access to equipment to take them much below 7, 10, even really 10 nanometers. And so in some cases in China, I think the issue that Gary mentioned, the Tsinghua Unigroup, they basically are going to reinvent themselves as a fabless company. Under the new management, under Li Bin, who you know seems to be a pretty sharp guy, and will probably be good for their you know to solve some of the problems that Gary mentioned in terms of that company. But they basically spun off the manufacturing pieces that are the crown jewels in some sense. You know, the YMTC on the memory side, and that's a success story to some degree because China's in the China memory space. They were nowhere, you know, 10 years ago, and now they're actually producing and will have global market share in areas like DRAM and 3D NAND. But that's still, you know, ramping that up and competing for China, competing on the high-end manufacturing side, whether it's memory or logic, is a pretty uphill battle, just because of the numbers you're talking about in the capex arena, and then the Chinese fabs not having access to advanced U.S. technology. So they'll be very successful, I think, in design. Chinese companies are very good at design, semiconductor design. Unisoc, for example, which is a key part of the new Tsinghua Unigroup effort there. So, you know, there's some good success stories there, but I think if you're just looking at sort of raw manufacturing ability in China at the high end, I mean, that's where Taiwan becomes more critical. And so to the extent that Chinese companies, like US companies, are relying on TSMC for all those advanced semiconductors, 92% of foundry at below 7 nanometers is at TSMC. And that becomes a big geopolitical issue too, right? Which we'll see. So Kerr mentioned that Mike Pompeo is in Taiwan, but also the US sent a very high-level delegation of former USG officials who are meeting today with President Tsai Ing-wen, including Mike Mullen, former the chief of staff, and also people like Evan Medeiros and Mike Green, who were senior officials at the U.S. National Security Council. And there, I think the goal is to sort of rein in Taiwan a little bit. Again, looking at the Russia-Ukraine situation, the feeling is, wow, that didn't work very well to have Ukraine, you know, defensively not part of NATO, and in the case of Taiwan, for example, we have strategic ambiguity, and we've already had the Japanese Prime Minister this week call for, you know, strategic clarity there. And I think the U.S. delegation of former USG officials, which China kvetched about a little bit, but we'll probably, you know, we won't go too far in criticizing. You know, they're delivering a message of sort of, you know, hey, Taiwan, we're backing Taiwan, but in terms of, you know, pushing forward in some of these areas that the Republicans in Congress, for example, have advocated, recognizing Taiwan, pushing, you know, changing the status of the relationship, I think there'll probably be an attempt to inject some calm into that, given the situation globally. But Taiwan long term, then the challenge is how to reduce that dependence on Taiwan. And that's why the U.S. is investing in these, you know, the onshoring of advanced manufacturing. But that's a 10-year process to really make a dent in that 92%. You have to look at 2030, and there's a lot of skepticism about whether the U.S. government will be able to sustain that kind of investment, those kinds of incentives, and be able to essentially pick winners, and then also develop a broader ecosystem around semiconductors and R&D and other areas, which are all part of some of the legislation that has had such trouble getting through Congress. So I think on the semiconductor side, it's a little bit tricky. What how China plays in that and how Taiwan plays in that. I think you got to look at both of those.
Mhm.
Yeah, Paul, what's interesting is, and Paul knows this really well, people get very confused. They think building a fab means you have a semiconductor industry. That's the manufacturing side. All the equipment, everything that goes into that fab comes from somewhere else. The software, the design, the whole process it comes from somewhere else. And so, I could see Pat Gelsinger cringing last night when Biden talked about building fabs and employing tens of thousands of people. It's like, no, they don't employ that many people. Those things are
3,000 people.
those things are so heavily automated at this point. And
Yeah.
so I think that's where, when you look at the history with China, and a great corollary to me that I remind my partners of is top 80 valuable software companies on the planet, about 8 are Chinese. Okay, 72 are foreign or American, European firms. And that's because there's been a long history of a lack of development focus on packaged software, enterprise software and things. It's been a lagging indicator for a very, very long time in China. And so the semiconductor is kind of the same thing. You're having to separate the value of hardware from the value of software. And that has not been something that China's excelled at. And we're seeing that now when you start to see firms, these nascent, the nascent work in advanced manufacturing and things like that. It's a real issue. I mean, you look at how long it's taken China to get the avionics right for their new plane. I mean, that's now, I think, 5 years late, 4 years late, or longer, maybe perhaps even longer. So these complex systems integrations, ecosystem formation is something that very few places in the world do very well.
Yeah.
And again, great investment opportunity, but Paul said 10 years, and that's probably about right. I mean, these investments are going to last as long as these funds that are set up to pursue them. It's a very long horizon.
Right.
Gary's comment brought back some memories. So I graduated in the late 80s, and I was first assigned a job at the Ministry of Electronics. And our minister was Jiang Zemin, right? What before it was Jiang Zemin, before he became the president of China. So we tried a number of times to make the Chinese operating system. We also tried to make the Chinese CPU. Never succeeded, of course. So a lot of reasons for it. Many of them were mentioned by Gary earlier. So it's really tough to have a centralized, command and control structure to do these things.
Right. So that's why the U.S. is going to remain the #1 innovator in the world.
In certain areas, yeah.
Well, China woke to the U.S.'s credit. It's actually, I think, and again, it's hard to be optimistic about the U.S. government efficiency, I will have to say, but they have woken up. So you have Eric Schmidt and you have Jared Cohen. You have a whole bunch of people, Paul and the work that he's doing. You have all these people that are now actually talking about a semiconductor strategy, an AI strategy, gene editing strategy. These were conversations that weren't even contemplated 10 or 15 years ago. But in order to maintain leadership, we, meaning the U.S., is going to have to do that. The other thing we're going to have to fix is our brain dead immigration policy. But these things now at least are being discussed and are on the table in a way that I hadn't seen for a very long time.
That's a real positive. And I think there's a question in here too about, you were talking about advanced manufacturing and AI, and there's a question in the chat box about whether China can lead in the robotics industry, considering, China has the world's largest robotics market, but it has no company leading in algorithm and a bunch of other technical items he's mentioned here. So how do you think China would lead robotics industry? And can China lead in the robotics industry? That's one of those areas where China's come up a long way. And the US is also a big player in the robotics field and has gotten much more involved in it through advanced manufacturing. So, and the conversion of all of our old factories to new automated ways of doing things. So what do you think, Gary? You see the question here in the chat?
Yeah, no, I think, well, put it this way. I mean, Wei made this comment. The talent and the entrepreneurism of the Chinese is without question, and perhaps without parallel, very, very strong. With enough time and enough money and a market opportunity, they will be successful in having leading companies, if not the leading company, in every single one of these areas. And so what you should expect is in every single area, you should have, the US will have a peer competitor, but let's not think about it as countries. There'll be companies based in China, companies based in the US, companies based in India. Over time, there'll be competitors in all these areas that are in different geographies. The semiconductor industry is very much like that. You have Tokyo Electron in Japan, you have ASML in the Netherlands, you have companies in the US, you have companies in Germany. So you have a very distributed intellectual property base. And I think that it's going to, in fact, I would seriously bet, Qiming seriously bets on the fact that China will have leaders in every single major category. To me, it's without question that's going to happen.
Yeah, I would just add
Are
quickly.
are those companies going to be just the leader within China, or do they have a chance to be? They don't really have a chance to be global leaders, do they?
Sure they do.
Well, in 2019, Chinese company Midea acquired KUKA, which was the leading German manufacturer of certain types of robotics. When I was touring a Huawei factory just before the pandemic, a lot of the robots in there were KUKA. And so on certain high-end applications, the Japanese, of course, companies and companies like KUKA are very dominant. But certainly Chinese companies are, again, they're sort of somewhere moving up on the value chain, just as they are in areas like semiconductor manufacturing equipment. But the problem also oftentimes is there's lots of smaller companies and there's no scale. And so I think that one of the focuses of the new focus on hard tech and coming out of the 45-year plan and the rectification campaign among the big tech platforms is to channel more investment into these really harder areas that Gary mentioned, like the systems integration and these really tough problems that require, in some cases, require scale, but bigger scale, and require much more of a well-developed industry ecosystem. And that's again where China has had trouble. But again, it's tricky because doing this all domestically, doing this, a lot of these value chains are global, and so the real issue to me is where does Chinese companies fit into that global value chain? And under what conditions do they fit into that? Because the US approach, for example, is, hey, we don't want China to have advanced manufacturing, so let's prevent ASML from shipping EUV equipment to SMIC. But there's never a very serious discussion about, okay, well, what is the actual national security gain there, for example, versus the lost. You lose a big player in that industry, and when you have a global chip shortage, now you have less capacity in the system, for example. And so there hasn't really been a very serious discussion, in my view, of sort of how Chinese companies under what conditions, subsidies, yes, we want there should be a discussion with the US on subsidies and these other issues. The problem right now is there is no dialogue between the US and China on any of these issues that impact the tech sector. I'm part of a track 2 dialogue where we're talking about semiconductors, we're talking about enterprise software that Gary mentioned. And we're kind of bogged down, and the Chinese want US export controls to be restricted. And the US side wants the Chinese to open up certain markets, market access. And so but we're the only game in town on the digital economy issues, for example. There's no government to government discussions around these tough issues in the digital economy. Data, another one that we haven't even talked about, which is a huge issue. And instead, we're probably going to have China trying to join CPTPP and the US pushing this Indo-Pacific economic framework with some type of non-binding agreements around digital trade that the Asian countries are probably not going to be extremely enthusiastic about. But so it's a real problem. You have these two huge digital economies and not a lot of discussion given the state of the relationship that we've talked about how to solve these issues and under what conditions Chinese companies in all these sectors should be participating in global value chains, right? It's sort of a zero-sum game. Chinese companies gain and the US loses. Whereas when in AI that Gary mentioned and semiconductors, it's a really a global game.
I can add some color to this with one example, specific one. So it was 2018. We were looking at robotic space. Two companies at the same time, right? One in China, one in the US. You know, similar business model, similar team. The US team seemed to be stronger. Team came out of Google. So the valuation for the first round of financing was 8 times difference, right? Chinese company was 8 times more expensive. You know, we invested in both. You know, this is Gen Fund. And then so years later, they both are developing really nicely. And you know, especially after the COVID, you know, labor shortage globally. So the US one is now roughly $500 million evaluation, and they're in the US market, in Japan, in South Korea. They can't make enough robots, right? The robots really help the restaurants, right? Delivering dishes and checks. Same thing. The Chinese one also got really adopted really quickly, not just by the restaurant, but also by hotels. You know, if you go to Beijing, Shanghai, in many, not just, you know, the top tier hotels, many second tier hotels, you see those, you know, delivering towels, water. And then, but the issue to Rebecca's earlier question is, you know, this company offers cheaper robot, but they're not trusted, right? They tried hard to push the robot into Japan, South Korea market, so far without success. So it seems to be there's a invisible wall at least at this point. They are negatively impacted by the geopolitical situation.
I see. Well, let me just share my own little example here, personal. So, you know, my book, Tech Titans of China, came out and it's been translated in a bunch of different languages. Do you think it's available yet in mainland China? Anyone hazard a guess? No, it's not. And we know that the reason it's given is that the Alibaba conflict. That's the reason that it's not being published in China. I'm so disappointed. Actually, I think the book would be well read there. So my question is, do you think that this Alibaba situation will be resolved in any way? And then can my book be published there?
Kerr?
I'm not going to say who the major publisher is behind it in the US and also in China, because but anyhow, I'm experiencing it. So yeah, so is the Alibaba situation going to be resolved?
Oh, Gary, you're the one who's friends with Jack, so I don't really have any particular insight on that. I guess I'll make a comment about, you know, we Rebecca, you and I talked a little bit about reset in terms of the regulatory environment there, and sort of getting the large tech companies under control in China. And, you know, is there a reset around that, right? And we talked about the regulatory things, and I see adjustments. I would push back on the word reset. And in other words, I don't see the regulators in China sort of saying, "Oh no, just kidding. I think we should do." No, I think what's happened there is they very wisely they do. I think all of Gary's comments about Ministry of Electronics and all this sort of stuff notwithstanding, I think that the Chinese government, they wisely stayed out of the way in the early days of the development of that industry, and then they kind of, and then I think President Xi is sort of going back to first principles, and he's sort of saying, wait, you know, we're a socialist country, and that stuff is really kind of off the rails there, so we need to curtail. So I do see, you know, some of those regulations came out, you know, 2000, 2001, you know, I think we'll probably see adjustments made because, and this ties to your question about innovation. And I was almost going to jump in there where you said, oh, okay, well, China might not be innovating. No. China is definitely going to be innovating. And the government is very much going to be supporting innovation. So I think a lot of their desires to control Jack and all these other people should not be confused with a desire to control innovation. I think it's the exact opposite. China has, the regulators, or, you know, the Chinese bureaucracy, they've got spreadsheets. They understand about the population decline, the working age population declining. The only way to solve that problem really is productivity. They have to change the productivity equation, and that's all about innovation. And so yeah, that's kind of how I see that. As for your book, Rebecca, I have no idea. That I don't know. But I do another just quick comment to tie this back to geopolitics and why I'm deliberately optimistic about how China's going to land on this Ukraine thing. They didn't step up on one side, but they're not really full-throated. I mean, despite the friendship that knows no limits, they're simply abstain. Note that they abstained; they didn't vote against, right? And so I think it remains to be seen just how solid a partner China is going to be with Russia. And this ties to another question that came up in the chat room that I'll respond to at the same time. Is there an alliance between, Belarus and is China part of that? Gary pretty much answered that in a different way. He said it won't matter. I think that's true. But I would answer it the other way is no, that's not an alliance. Again, a group of countries that all respond pretty quickly to an opportunity to put the thumb in the eye in the United States. That's one thing. That's not an alliance. And I think one of the things, just to throw North Korea into this, I mean, this is something that Trump never understood, and a lot of people misunderstand, is that North Korea, just because North Korea is the enemy of the United States, does not make it the friend of China. You look at North Korea, there's only one country on earth that they dislike and mistrust almost as much as they dislike and mistrust the United States, and that's China. So no, I think I wouldn't be singing kumbaya too quickly here between Russia and China. Remember why, back to the 50th anniversary of Communique, why did Mao decide to open up those discussions with Nixon? It's because he hated the United States until he didn't. It was all about the Soviet Union. And it was about the relationship there. So no, there's no their interests are temporarily aligned, but I don't see that being emerging as an alliance anytime soon.
Okay, Paul, there's a question for you in the chat box too. Can you see it?
I can see it. Yeah. So, how receptive is the U.S. Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to members of the CPTPP? It's a great question. And one of the challenges is we don't really have too much detail on what the IPEF is going to entail. And there will be a digital economy piece, for example, which I think would be attractive to those countries. The problem is, CPTPP has a pretty well developed chapter on digital economy and cross-border data localization. And so the question will be for those countries, how much effort do they want to put into some sort of an arrangement, as the U.S. government has called it, a series of modules that can sort of proceed at their own pace and come and have different outcomes, but nothing like a binding trade agreement. And so the challenge for the IPF for the U.S. is to sort of sell this as something that is worth doing and worth engaging with in the U.S. in the Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific. I tend to I don't really like the term Indo-Pacific because I think it's a sort of a weird creation to bring in India into the game here. But it's a good question because CPTPP is those 11 countries are doing well. There's a lot of other plurilateral and bilateral agreements in Asia, the DEPA, Singapore, Japan, a lot of other trade agreements which are advancing the ball in areas like the digital economy. So the U.S. is really playing catch up here. And one of the problems is the USTR doesn't really want to do this, right? I mean, Catherine Tai is not interested in any kind of trade deal. And so they're kind of being dragged, I think, kicking and screaming into this. Gina Raimondo, the good news is that Commerce is really a player. She's a friend of the business community. She wants to have a positive agenda in Asia. And Kirk Campbell at the White House does too. So there's a lot of pressure from the business community for the administration to have this positive agenda. The problem is going to be, as the questioner rightly asks, is, what's in it for those countries in the region? Japan will certainly, sign on to some of the modules. and Malaysia and others. But I think the region would really like to have the U.S. and China in CPTPP, right? That would be the optimal situation because there are already those really high bars around the digital economy. China is, has of course applied to the CPTPP. In our Track 2 dialogue, we talk a lot about the data issue and whether Chinese domestic data laws are flexible enough. And our Chinese interlocutors assured us that the data regime in China is flexible enough to allow, for example, for aligning with CPTPP Chapter 14, which is a huge deal, right? And China's going to trial some of these things in some of the free trade zones, like in Shanghai. And so, China is serious about this. Of course, there's lots of obstacles to the CPTPP membership, and some of the countries in the region may not support that, but certainly a lot of them do, like Singapore and Malaysia and others. So this year is going to be very important in that regard to see, can China sell CPTPP to the region before U.S. tries to sell IPEF to the region?
Oh no, too many acronyms.
Right. But there's a lot of acronyms flying around. And then Taiwan is sort of in the middle of both.
Yeah. Taiwan, I'll just add a little bit of color there
to
CPTPP
I also want to get
Taiwan
poll.
joining. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I want to have a little time to get to our poll, which is kind of a fun part.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Just no. There's huge enthusiasm for CPTPP among the multinationals, the American business community. Anyway, I mean, it was a big push around TPP, but then my conversations in DC, there is enthusiasm on the Hill. I think there are people in Congress that are interested, and I'm talking to people like Rick Larson and Darren LaHood, of the House Working Group on China, and I think that there's at least a willingness to have a discussion about CPTPP. Whereas I think after in the transition from Obama to Trump, TPP was just absolutely dead, mostly because the American voter just was allergic to trade generally, and I think that's actually been our biggest obstacle to these agreements is the voting public, and it comes back to
really I know, I'm really amazed.
And I think that this is connected to China, to a lot of the negative sentiments. I mean, there have been with this last week, there's a lot more reasons to be negative about China, but on the trade front, I think there's really nobody out there making the case for globalization and for trade among sort of U.S. leadership. And I think that as a result, the U.S. voting public has really become more anti-globalization, anti-trade, and China plays such a role in that it has translated into anti-China. And so I think that's not the whole reason by any means, but I'm cautiously optimistic about CPTPP, especially because I'll stop here, Rebecca.
Okay, let's go. I have to get to the poll, or we're going to run out of time. The poll is really fun, and it will provoke a little bit more conversation too. So hold on a second. I'm launching the poll, and I'm going to read out the questions because I don't think the panelists can see them, but everyone who's participating can see them, I think. All right, so which country will lead tech innovation in 5 years? The US, China, Israel, or India? It's a really wide open one. I didn't put any other countries in there as a multiple choice. Okay, so among the panelists, what's your vote? Everyone just say your country. US, China, Israel, India?
US for me.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, nobody else.
US for me as well.
US
okay.
And maybe India.
Oh, okay. Which way will US regulation of China tech swing? More or less, or about the same? Yeah, these are multiple choices, so this is not hard.
I think it's about the same, because pendulums always go from one extreme to the other, and we're just going to go back and forth for a while.
Right.
I think more.
That was Paul's.
Maybe Paul said more. I said maybe marginally more because there are a lot already. The issue is more of enforcement, right?
Okay. Will China tech giants within China see more restrictions? Yes, no. It's only a yes or a no.
Probably yes.
Anyone else? What happened to Kerr? Is he still there? What's the future of U.S.-China business tech relations? Here we get into these C's, the cooperation, collaboration, or conflict, or the keep at a distance, the D there. So 3 C's or a D.
Intense competition.
Intense. Oh yes, I left
That's what
that.
the Biden administration has said.
Uh-huh.
I hope
intense
competition and not confrontation.
Okay. Anyone else, Gary?
I would agree with Paul.
Yeah, that was a good answer.
Yeah, I think the intention from both sides would be from the business community collaboration, but you know, not sure this is realistic given
Okay.
the current climate.
Okay, good. So most 2/3 of the audience says U.S. will be the winner in tech innovation. Most people, 2/3, 3/4 say there'll be more regulation, U.S. regulation of China tech. China tech giants within China see more restrictions. 3/4 say yes. Cooperate on this issue, keep at a distance. About half said keep at a distance. And I should have had in there about the competition as well, but that was not one of the multiple choices, but it came out in the answers from the panelists. So, okay, that's always kind of a fun way to end our discussion for today. And I would really like to thank all of you for joining and sharing your thoughts. And I say we'd let us out at about 5:15, so we're getting to about that point. And I also just want to say a few words about our next program, which is our usual Ask a VC series. The next one is going to be with Carmen Jung from Vertex Ventures in Singapore. That's March 16th at 4 p.m. Pacific time. So that's going to be a good one. And then we have a program about Hong Kong. And I've named it Hong Kong Restart 2022. As you know, Hong Kong is not right now going through COVID situation. And so anyhow, Hong Kong Restart 2022, that's April 26th. There's a lot of issues to discuss around there, but Hong Kong also has had a lot of success with startups and unicorns. And of course, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange has been going strong. So hopefully you'll join on for that. And thank you everyone again for joining us. And let's thank our panelists. Thank you, Gary, Paul, Kurt, and Wei. Thanks for being with
Rebecca.
us. And actually, we're right on the dot, 5:15 or 8:15 if you're in New York, and 9:15 if you're in Hong Kong, or if you're in Australia. We have people coming on globally to our show.
Yeah,
they're
excellent.
signing on from all places.
Yeah, terrific. Right on time, Rebecca. I'm sorry,
yeah.
I got to run.
Yeah,
I've got
okay.
other
Yeah,
things.
thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, everybody.
Much appreciated.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, take care.
Great seeing you, Gary.
Hi, everybody.
Gotta catch up.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.